Hello, my name is Nicole Grinnan, and I am an archaeologist with the Florida Public Archaeology Network at the University of West Florida. And I'm very pleased to present this paper on behalf of myself and my two co-authors, Dr. Ashley Lemke, Assistant Professor at the University of Texas at Arlington and Chair of the Advisory Council on Underwater Archaeology, and Jay Haigler, Board Member for Diving with a Purpose, Dive Safety Officer for the National Association of Black Scuba Divers, and member of the Underwater Adventure Seekers. Following a panel discussion that touched on inequities in underwater archaeology and science diving in general at the SHA 2021 virtual conference, my co-authors and I continued the conversation after the conference. Our goal was to draw greater attention to the lack of diversity in the field, but more importantly, to perhaps inspire creative problem solving and establishing pipelines for young students interested in the field and engaging communities and community stakeholders with their underwater cultural heritage. Our first task was to identify disparities that existed in the discipline. While there has been excellent scholarship on issues of representation across gender, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, class, and ability, how do we see this specifically reflected in underwater archaeology? Our second goal was to identify the barriers that existed, barriers preventing better representation. We realized very quickly that this was a massive subject to be tackled. In the interest of actionability, we decided to break up barriers into three categories: those that are programmatic, those that are institutional, and those that are structural or social. This paper deals with the first category, programmatic barriers, and divides those barriers into knowledge-based and skills-based. Finally, it is fine to discuss these issues, but we felt that it is also critical to offer solutions and to provide insight into what has been done already, letting others know that there are resources out there to overcome barriers to inclusivity. Before we get started, we felt it important to clarify some of the terminology that we use. Here, we've decided to define underwater archaeology as broadly as possible to include any archaeological research taking place in an underwater setting. When we talk about scuba diving, we refer to it as a tool or means for achieving a particular goal. This is truly in the spirit of the larger discourse around scientific diving, but we can also extend this to the recreational, commercial, and professional realms. Finally, we have largely borrowed a definition of inclusivity from the Cambridge Dictionary, that it is the quality of trying to include many different types of people with fair and equal treatment. We would amend that, however, to read fair and equitable treatment. In the interest of focusing on this paper, we have also drawn primarily from barriers and solutions here in the US and within our various institutional experiences. We acknowledge that there are many groups doing excellent work to overcome issues of representation outside the US and outside of our organizations. As mentioned before, there's a great deal of scholarship that discusses issues of representation in archaeology across many categories, communities, and identities. A few notable examples include Maria Franklin's 1997 paper, "Why Are There So Few Black American Archaeologists?" and a subsequent survey initiated by the Society for American Archaeology in 2016, each suggesting that fewer than 1% of respondents identified as Black. Focusing on gender, a recent paper by Heath, Stout, and Hannigan see more gender parity in the discipline in recent years, but note that most positions of authority continue to be held by male archaeologists. For more extensive literature review, you can view our paper via the QR code at the end of this presentation. For the sake of time, I will summarize by just saying that archaeology remains a fairly exclusive field. Within the broader context of institutional inequality, exclusivity, and structural racism impacting the field overall, underwater archaeology has additional barriers for underrepresented communities seeking to gain entry, particularly when it comes to knowledge about career opportunities and access to the specific skills needed to conduct this type of research. Looking at data from the US, the 2018 Diving Equipment and Marketing Association, or DEMA, analysis on scuba divers shows that 73.2% of open water divers, the basic level of certification, 73.2% of those divers are white, 60.1% are male, 32.6% have at least one college degree. In terms of marketing scuba to new individuals, the same DEMA report considers highly likely customers as those in the summit estates, top professionals, and established elite market clusters. These clusters are described as 73.2% white, with individual net worth calculated at $100,000 to $249,000. Although finances are not the only factor impacting inclusion and participation, they clearly play a significant role in the contemporary scuba diving community. It comes as no surprise then that a field that involves both archaeology and scuba diving will be especially exclusive. Overall, underwater archaeologists are largely a homogeneous group, particularly along lines of race and wealth, categories that often overlap. We find it entirely appropriate to ask questions like, why haven't things changed? How can we do better? And why are there so few underwater archaeologists of color? In the context of the broader development of offshore environments and with infrastructure improvement across the US on the horizon, we see underwater archaeology as a growing discipline with a need for qualified practitioners, and providing access to all communities is essential. As a place to begin the conversation, this discussion largely centers on racial and socioeconomic diversity due to the availability of similarly focused survey data from scuba training agencies and archaeological publications. It is important to consider, however, that these issues are also barriers to representation at large. Before any training is started and skills are learned, there must first be an awareness of underwater archaeology as a field, information about where to get educated, and an understanding of what career prospects exist. Career opportunities are based on many factors, including potential for economic and social mobility. In wanting to provide a lasting impact on their communities, many Black Americans focus on careers in areas such as public policy, healthcare, civil rights legislation. Asian American career choices are often driven by traditional cultural values, familial obligations, and financial considerations. Related to this, perceived social impact has resulted in fewer Black archaeologists in general. To remedy the lack of representation in underwater archaeology and anthropology more broadly, there is sufficient need to create a pipeline in getting students interested in the discipline. Creating pipelines becomes a very real challenge when there is a lack of educational resources and curriculum options in primary and secondary education institutions in underrepresented communities. At the college level, undergraduate classes that focus on underwater archaeology are often found at universities with an underwater archaeologist on staff. There are also only a handful of graduate programs that offer specialized training. And in underwater archaeology, many of those are located in one state, Florida. Program curricula are primarily nautical in scope, specializing in shipwrecks and maritime lifeways, which leaves remarkably few offerings for students hoping to study topics such as submerged landscapes or indigenous archaeology. Skills-based barriers are those concerning actual training and hands-on experience. Required skills for each discipline also present the most obvious differences between terrestrial and underwater archaeology. While one of the most important skills for an underwater archaeologist is scuba diving, and diving is often thought to be a prerequisite, this article argues that it does not necessarily have to be. First, diving itself can be a multifaceted barrier. Scuba requires a significant financial and personal investment from those who may be interested in pursuing underwater archaeology as a career or an avocation. Initial scuba certification can be expensive. Beyond the individual costs of scuba diving, there are necessary infrastructure requirements for scuba training that are not equally distributed across communities. For example, there may be a lack of swimming pools, inconsistent internet capabilities for e-learning, or few certifying scuba programs. In addition to training fees, some level of investment in personal equipment is expected, and that can range widely. The cost of field schools alone promotes exclusivity, and the cost for underwater field schools, especially those that include diving, are often equally or more expensive. If we look at remote sensing and other data collection technologies in underwater archaeology, to both collect and process data requires training in the same way that users of terrestrial remote sensing techniques such as ground penetrating radar do. Acquiring training for and access to these instruments can be additional barriers in terms of both time and money. Now let's talk about overcoming these barriers. As has been suggested, one of the greatest challenges for broad inclusion in underwater archaeology has been the lack of awareness about maritime heritage and archaeological resources at the local level. Without visibility on the landscape of everyday life, submerged archaeological resources can become forgotten or neglected. In recent years, one of FPAN's, the Florida Public Archaeology Network's biggest goals for promoting the incorporation of underwater archaeology and community heritage has been to seek out established or popular neighborhood meeting spaces. Although many one-off presentations or hour-long children's programs do not necessarily involve hands-on exposure, such as through diving, the relatively simple act of building awareness about underwater archaeology and related fields is crucial for several reasons. Second, exposure to these subjects, first, it invigorates underwater archaeological resources as a component of local heritage. And second, exposure to these subjects may encourage people to entertain underwater archaeology as a career possibility. Finally, for those looking to act, but not necessarily to pursue a career in underwater archaeology, introductory presentations or programs can provide inspiration to become involved. Many of the volunteers in FPAN's Public Archaeology Lab and in its community science education engagement programs first become interested after public talks by FPAN staff. Their participation in lab activities, resource monitoring, and data collection analysis from fieldwork provides a very real benefit to the work of archaeologists. Diving with a Purpose has also made significant strides in engaging community stakeholders with underwater archaeology. Approximately 90% of the 500 DWP advocates are African Americans, Hispanics, and Africans from underrepresented communities. Within the past 8 years, DWP participants have conducted over 150 in-person presentations in community settings in 25 states and in Washington, D.C. In many cases, these peer-to-peer interactions provide the first opportunity for audiences to see a person of color who is a scuba diver and is someone involved in underwater archaeology. Complementary to the need for awareness building is the acknowledged deficit of anthropological and archaeological education in grade school curricula, particularly for those schools that do not have resources to supplement daily lesson plans with field trips or guest speakers. This entails the production of appealing programs that touch on the breadth of lived experiences and provide local relevance. In addition to drawing connections to the past at the community level, FPAN has found success in moving beyond the traditional presentation format in schools. Programs may include elements of formal presentations, but they should consider emphasizing discussion and hands-on activities to support themes and educational goals. For example, in the Shipwreck on a Tarp underwater archaeology program, students are invited as a group to decipher the meaning of artifact clusters on a shipwreck, and then to map them using basic grid techniques. Diving with a Purpose and underwater adventure seekers, along with their strategic partners, have also created and executed teacher training, mentoring, networking, and community capacity building programs that increase awareness and diversity by integrating maritime archaeology into STEAM and social studies curricula. One particular effort by DWP was a partnership with underwater adventure seekers, NOAA's Office of National Marine Sanctuaries, and the National Marine Sanctuary Foundation to create a program that introduced 120 to 140 10th grade students from a demographically diverse Henry E. Lackey and North Point high schools in Charles County, Maryland, to expose them to the science and history of scuba diving and marine archaeology and biology. FPAN has found that it can be overwhelming for individual teachers to add more to their already crowded and laser-focused curricula. As a result, it has been more useful for us to work with a top-down approach. District social studies coordinators can help provide archaeology educators with streamlined access to K-12 teachers. They can disseminate program information more broadly and can help set up workshops during which teachers can receive continuing education credits. And of course, when possible, archaeologists should also work to get themselves a seat at the table in the implementation of district-level lessons in archaeology and anthropology, as well as in the formation of state-level education standards. Now, although the costs of scuba are real and substantial, there are various solutions that can help ease the burden of investment for those interested in getting involved with underwater archaeology at either the professional or avocational level. The Underwater Adventure Seekers and its sister organization, the Los Angeles Black Underwater Explorers, have invested in dive lockers, offering shared equipment for members, and mitigating the cost to individuals. For entry-level scuba certifications, Underwater Adventure Seekers only require students to purchase masks, fins, and snorkels. Other programs or organizations can consider a similar approach. Arrangements can be made with manufacturers or local dive shops to negotiate lower prices for larger group purchases, resulting in a 15 to 30% discount on basic materials. Written materials can also be bought in bulk, subsidizing the cost per student. And even though e-learning is common in scuba certifications today, instructors cannot presume everyone has internet or computer access. Course materials should therefore be offered in both print form and online. Beyond equipment, Diving with a Purpose created and continues to manage maritime archaeological field schools for youth. And the University of Texas at Arlington offers a non-diving underwater archaeology field school for undergraduate students. Costs of this field school, including transportation, lodging, meals, dive equipment when needed, and materials are often subsidized by grants, and program instructors volunteer most of their time. Although there is no substitute for a scuba-trained underwater archaeologist on a project that requires dive operations, there are non-diving opportunities available for students and for the public to get involved. Some examples include getting involved with lab operations, training and working in remote sensing techniques, and even focusing efforts on shallow water sites that can be visited via wading or snorkeling. In addition to cost mitigating practices and non-diving options, there are also emerging scholarship programs designed to address the financial needs of underrepresented communities. This list is by no means comprehensive, but it does provide an overview of some of the more relevant opportunities available to those interested in diving and/or underwater archaeology and who find themselves generally underrepresented in the field. Now, as we return to these initial questions, I believe there's a great deal to discuss related to issues of representation. While we have focused on just programmatic barriers to inclusivity here, my co-authors and I are turning now to larger institutional and structural barriers that have affected inclusivity in our discipline. Moving forward, it is important to focus on sustainability and capacity building rather than only short or near-term outcomes. Although increasing diversity and equity for a single field season is important, creating networks, peer groups, role models, sustained research initiatives, and ongoing programs will ensure that inclusion is a growth area over time. Within the past year, the convergence of the two pandemics, COVID-19 and long-term systematic racial inequality or inequity in the United States, has provided an opportunity for universal structural change. And that means to break the barriers discussed here, those means do exist, and they exist in intentional decision-making among current practitioners to foster the next generation of underwater archaeologists. Thank you very much for allowing me to present my paper in another format, or our paper in another format here. If you wish to read the far more in-depth paper that we recently published on this topic in Advances in Archaeological Practice, you can find it via open access via the QR code here. So thank you all, and always feel free to reach out if you have any comments or questions. Thank you so much.